But there's another figure that starts to emerge in the 1980s. And it's one of the reasons I'm kind of rolling past the 80s really quickly, is because the power in North Korea starts to wane from Kim Il-sung a little bit in the 1980s. He kind of becomes co-leader in this period. Does this mean that, North Korea is democratizing, that the cult of personality of the Kim family is disappearing? No, it's because a new Kim is entering the stage in the 1980s. He's the next person we're going to talk about, Kim Jong-il. I'm going to clear the board, and we're going to go on about him just a little bit. So just finished cleaning off the board. In the Soviet Union, the cult of personality around Joseph Stalin started to fall apart basically immediately when he died, 1953. Eventually that leads to Nikita Khrushchev taking power, maneuvering his way to the tippy top, and then giving his secret speech in 1956 decrying the cult of personality. In China, Mao Zedong, as he approached his death in the 1970s, he kind of fails to get a successor picked properly. He ends up going with Hua Guofeng after like 3 or 4 other choices. And if you watch my last video, know that Hua Guofeng basically was the paramount leader of China for a very short period of time. It started to become sidelined by Deng Xiaoping, really almost before he took power, but let's just say 1978. So Hua Guofeng got 2 years as paramount leader of China, barely. And so, we think of these totalitarian cult of personality communist states, but we also think about the things that changed in them after their founders, after their big honcho died. And obviously for the point of the story, we're discounting Lenin. We're just talking about Stalin and the Soviet Union. But the point remains that there's a lack of a plan of who will take over. Stalin makes basically no plans for his death. Mao makes bad plans for his death and succession. And so there's a scramble after they go. And Kim Il-sung, as the leader of North Korea, watches this and wants to avoid it. And one of the interesting things about Kim Il-sung is when we had his name up on the board, remember he was the paramount leader in North Korea from 1945 until 1994. So from the moment Korea is independent from Japan until the 1990s, that means he was present for Stalin, he was present for Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, right? Yeltsin, after the Soviet Union's gone. He's present for Mao, for Deng Xiaoping, and even for a little bit of Jiang Zemin. And he's around for decades of presidents as well. He's almost like a little bit like the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth or whatever, that just was around for so long. You're like, oh my gosh, this is a pillar. What? You have something to say? Yeah? What else do you think about the cult of personality? Okay, so now we have that perspective as well. You interrupted me so much. Yeah? Sweet girl? Yeah, what else do you think? Yeah? Okay, we're going to continue with Kim Jong-il now. Because that's ultimately what Kim Il-sung chooses to do, is he chooses to pick his successor and groom them in their... Gosh, okay. I'm losing my mind. My cat is very insistent that she needs my attention, but we're going to power through here. And we're going to go a little quicker now. If you've been with me this long, we've established Kim Il-sung. We can get through Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un pretty quickly because, like I said, once you understand Kim Il-sung, everyone else is just a reaction to him. So in the 70s, Kim Il-sung chooses his son, Kim Jong-il, to take his place. So Kim Jong-il is going to take Kim Il-sung's place. Now, according to the history books and, in terms of being the tippy-top paramount leader, Kim Jong-il is only going to be doing that from his father's death in 1994 until his own death in 2011. However, Kim Jong-il doesn't just appear like Hua Guofeng does when Mao Zedong dies. Kim Jong-il doesn't just come out of nothing or have to fight his way to the top like Khrushchev. Kim Jong-il is handpicked we think somewhere in the 1970s, and is actually formally announced as the successor to Kim Il-sung in 1980. This is weird. Okay, this is, again, Kim Il-sung is not a great communist because hereditary, like, you know, we could say all sorts of things about communists, but hereditary, like monarch style succession from father to son, that's not a communist thing. Marx never talked about that. Lenin never talked about that. Stalin and Mao never considered such things, right? They at least were choosing like party apparatchiks or whatever, or in this case of Stalin making no plans. Like the idea that you'd install your own son to take over your cult of personality after, that's a hell of an innovation. And again, it's just more evidence that like Kim Il-sung was just interested in power, interested in nationalism, maybe interested in himself and his legacy, but communism, building socialism to eventually fall away and have a utopia. No, this is nuts. It's announced that Kim Jong-il is going to be his father's successor officially for the world on October 10th of 1980. But he's making his way in the scenes. He's usurping some of the other potential heirs of Kim Il-sung, like his uncle and his half-brother, in the 1970s. And one of the ways that it's assumed that Kim Jong-il, because we don't know for sure exactly, we don't have like a paper from Kim Il-sung saying, I chose not my brother, not my first son, I chose Kim Jong-il from my second marriage, I think, to an actress. I chose him because of this reason. We don't really have that. What we do have, however, is evidence that Kim Jong-il made his way up the echelons by helping his father build his cult of personality even bigger than it already was in the 70s and 80s. Kim Jong-il joins the Communist Party officially in 1961. Unlike his father, he doesn't have much international experience, so he doesn't, as far as I know, he doesn't speak Russian or Chinese. He doesn't study abroad like his son is going to do, Kim Jong-il's son, that is, Kim Jong-un. He doesn't spend time outside of Korea. Instead, he studies at the Kim Il-sung University. And he is hyper-focused, however, even though he never leaves North Korea. He is obsessed with things non-North Korea, particularly cultural things non-North Korea, particularly film and American films, Hollywood films, and South Korean films. Kim Jong-il is going to begin a collection, which I believe reaches something like 20,000 films. He's going to become obsessed with having the embassies around the world of North Korea literally like sending in films from all over the world for him to view. He's going to enjoy South Korean music. He enjoys karaoke. He enjoys the cultural things that come from outside North Korea. And what this instills in Kim Jong-il as a young man is that the way to people's hearts, the way to change politics, is not necessarily only through top-down leadership, a singular thought system, though he does believe in those things, but is through the power of propaganda. And so in 1967, he becomes head of, what do you know, the propaganda department in North Korea. I have two different names for it. One is propaganda and agitation department, which I think is an awesome name for a government bureaucracy. Go agitate. I mean, I know what they're saying in communist parlance, but it's still kind of a funny concept. The head of state propaganda and info. Okay. So Kim Jong-il starts to make these films that lionize his father and build the cult of personality even bigger. And I said earlier that he had a film called The Flower Girl where all these things are going bad. And then Kim Jong-il rides in and liberates the girl and her flowers or whatever. One of his most famous works on his IMDb page, still can't believe I'm saying that, about a communist leader, Sea of Blood, which is, I believe, about the Japanese resistance, though it could have been about the Korean War. And the reason I'm staring at my notes so much is because I have a couple names that I can't memorize, and it's a couple people that Kim Jong-il kidnaps from South Korea to make films in North Korea, to help him make films. There's a whole book about it. I believe it's called Kim Jong-il Productions. You can read it. It's an interesting book. I haven't read it cover to cover. But the story is of a South Korean film director named Shin Sang-ok and Choi Un-hee. And Choi Un-hee is the wife of Shin Sang-ok. They have interesting biographies of how they came to make films together as this power couple in the South Korean film industry, but they are dragged from 1978 to 1986. They are in North Korea as basically prisoners of Kim Jong-il and help him make propaganda films that lionize his father, Kim Il-sung. The two eventually escape. It's absolutely insane. And we actually get a voice recording of Kim Jong-il describing what they're going to do for him and things. We don't get much of Kim Jong-il. He doesn't give very many. I think he gives one speech at some point when his father is still alive, and then he doesn't speak publicly again. His son, Kim Jong-il's son, Kim Jong-un, is going to give a lot more public speeches. Kim Jong-il, for this reason, because he's not particularly personable and because he's often behind the scenes, behind the camera, literally, he's often written off as sort of this person that was just an awkward leader of North Korea. He wasn't beloved like his father. Probably true. Is not beloved like his son is now becoming in North Korea. Probably also true. But that doesn't mean that he was like stupid or completely disconnected. And part of that narrative also boils down to the fact that Kim Jong-il didn't like to leave Korea. Kim Il-sung, even though he's going to rewrite the history a lot, does spend a considerable amount of time outside of the country. Kim Jong-un is going to spend time outside of the country. He's going to visit Russia a lot, and he just recently visited China. We'll talk about that soon. Kim Jong-un is also going to get a large chunk of his education outside of North Korea in Switzerland. Kim Jong-il, meanwhile, stays in Korea basically the entire time, which means that Western intelligence has even less information about Kim Jong-il when he eventually takes power from his father in 1994, even though by the time he takes the ultimate power, he's already been the announced successor publicly for 14 years. And he's already been on the stage since the 1970s. In fact, he's been on the stage really as an up-and-comer since 1967 when he starts to run the propaganda and agitation department. In the 1970s, he makes this rise. He usurps his uncle. He usurps his half-brother. They're thrown to the side. Kim Il-sung decides, you, my boy, Kim Jong-il, are going to be the man. By the 1980s, when North Korea is doing all this crazy pariah state stuff, bombings, kidnappings, international crime, like building a nuclear program that's even alarming to the Soviets and the Chinese, not paying back international debt, having an economy that's faltering. This is also a time in which Kim Jong-il is starting to become a parallel leader of North Korea. And there's these accounts from defectors, and the one I believe I'm thinking of right now is Jin-Sung, who in 2014, as a defector, published a book called Dear Leader. Yeah, and we're also going to talk a little bit about Thae Yong-Ho, who's a defector, who wrote a book in 2024 called Passcode to the Third Floor. We get a little bit, and we have to be careful. We have to take everything with a grain of salt because we really don't know for sure. It's only one person's account, or in this case, I'm referencing two accounts, but whatever. When they tell us things about what goes on inside North Korea, of course we want to listen because we don't get too many defector accounts, especially not these days as it's become harder and harder to get away and to escape. But what we learn from these insider accounts, we think, is that during the 1980s, Kim Jong-il is actually starting to run the government more than his father is. His father's getting older. His father celebrates his 70th birthday in 1982, and his health is somewhat on the decline until his death in 1994. So he makes some appearances after that, Kim Il-sung does, but the day-to-day government operations are running on parallel tracks at this time. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that according to some defector accounts in the 1980s and the early 1990s, if you needed a decision made or you needed to give a report, you would give that report first to the office of Kim Jong-il, and then, only then, would you give it to Kim Il-sung. So there is a order of operations that is changing in this period that would lead us to believe that even before he officially takes power in 94, Kim Jong-il is at least partially running the country, even if his father continues to have the final say, which means that when we think about the South Korean airline bombing in 1987, before the Seoul Olympics, when we think about the very strange World Youth Festival that happened in 1989, it's a athletic competition that happened after the Seoul Olympics, but in Pyongyang in North Korea is basically the answer to South Korea emerging on the world stage. We have to imagine that Kim Jong-il had something to do, or a lot to do with that spectacle. And even earlier on, the Burma bombing, these attempted assassinations, we have to assume that Kim Jong-il in the 1980s was already affecting some of these decisions, that it wasn't merely Kim Il-sung doing it. And so we could theoretically fudge this number here to say that somewhere between 1980 and 1994, Kim Jong-il takes power. His father is definitely still in charge. He's when Kim Il-sung dies, he's considered the eternal president. And President Eternal. That's Kim Il-sung. Right, and in fact, when Kim Il-sung dies in 1984, there is ostensibly 3 years of mourning before Kim Jong-il will officially take any of the titles that his father held. So, premier of the party or premier of the government. He never takes the term president. That term is abolished, basically, so that Sung can hold it forever. General secretary, chairman of the party, chairman of the Central Military Commission. These are all going to go to Kim Jong-il after a few years of mourning of the death of Kim Il-sung, which, Western observers at the time, because this is the first transition in North Korea's history, they're not totally sure if they're going to pull it off, right? And so there's a feeling at the beginning that maybe Kim Jong-il is not taking these offices because, well, maybe actually there's power struggles in the North Korean government, or maybe they're going to, open up and reform like China did under Deng Xiaoping. And, it didn't take long for people to realize, no, that's not what's going on at all. Just fun facts. 1982, real quick. We're going to just a little bit go back to the 80s just for a second. I promise it'll be very quickly. 1982, Kim Jong-il unveils for his father's 70th birthday, Juche Tower. Very famous. I'll put a picture up. Very famous tower in Pyongyang, and effectively the Arc de Triomphe, the victory, the triumph tower, the triumph arc that would theoretically be celebrating Kim Il-sung's victory over Japan in 1945. We all know that's a fake hagiography, but what's also fake hagiography is Kim Jong-il's birth. Kim Jong-il was actually born in 1941. And he was actually born in the Soviet Union. And he's going to be brought back with his father, presumably in September 1945. And, from then on, he's not going to remember his literal early days in the Soviet Union. And from then on, he's going to live in Korea. But the history books are actually going to change this. The official history in North Korea is going to say Kim Jong-il was actually born in 1942. And he wasn't born in the Soviet Union. No. He was born on Mount Paektu. Mount Paektu is a very legendary mountain, actually near the border with China, that is going to be the legendary birthplace of Kim Jong-il. And there's going to be all these stories. When he was born, birds, brought him, and there was thunder cracking, and there were storms, and all the party revolutionaries put down their arms and celebrated and came to see the savior boy birth. It sounds a lot like Jesus, all right? When Kim Jong-il is born, very silly. And I think his birth name is Yuri or Yura. So he becomes Kim Jong-il. It would be Yuri Kim would be his birth name. And I think there's even something very Russian in between that, Yuri Ivanovich Kim or something. And then over time, obviously it gets way more Koreanized to Kim Jong-il. And that's the man we know today. The reason I wanted to go back to the 1980s, though, was to talk about some of the events that are going on in 1989, 1990, 1991. That is the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. These are things that are going to be extremely difficult. I'm almost done. We just got Kim Jong-un left, Sophie. We can do it. North Korea's economy is already doing bad. It's already becoming a pariah state in the 70s. Its economy is looking awful in the 80s. It's looking like a literal terrorist state nation state. It is extremely bizarre. There are things going on, like diplomats have to bring back cash and sell illicit things and participate in like actual organized crime where they're stationed in order to fund the Foreign Office of North Korea to keep embassies open and to feed the lifestyle of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. And then the worst comes to worst, which is that the Soviet Union and this entire system of international communism collapses. And you know, when East Germany goes, like Erich Honecker, the paramount leader in East Germany, had been a really good friend of Kim Il-sung, and had visited Pyongyang many times. And in fact, when Erich Honecker merged the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party in East Germany into a single party, the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, this is something that would influence Kim Il-sung's merging of the North and South Korean Communist Party in the late 1940s. I think I got that timeline right. If I didn't, somebody can tell me in the comments. Maybe it's reversed. Maybe Kim Il-sung influenced Erich Honecker in East Germany. The point being that losing these allies, even ones that maybe not have been like, obviously East Germany was a satellite state of the Soviet Union, was part of that bloc. So it's not that essential that these Eastern countries were giving aid and technology to North Korea, though some of that was happening. But losing all your friends all at once kind of sucks. And China in this period, in like the early 90s, this is the period of Jiang Zemin. This is the period when the Tiananmen Square massacre has just occurred. And there is, a desire in China to go inward and to deal with their own internal problems. And China also suffered greatly after the fall of the Soviet Union, even though they, had the Soviet split and everything, and they always pretended to not be BFFs. Nonetheless, like this block goes, and the effects are catastrophic in Korea. And a famine kicks off. And the peak famine years in North Korea are 1995 to, I believe, 1998. This is when something like 600,000 to 1 million people die of famine. Now, there's an open question that's a little hard to answer as to why did the collapse of the Soviet Union mean that 500,000 to 1 million people died in North Korea? Was the Soviet Union sending food into North Korea? Is that what the problem is? And the answer is not really. There's a couple of things. One is that there is a flood. There's a period of flooding in North Korea that perpetuates or exacerbates the food shortage. But there's also a couple of things that are being provided by the Soviets and the Chinese that go away. Now, a lot of the industrial technology in North Korea came from the Soviet Union. Remember, it's the Soviets that helped Korea industrialize in the 40s and the 50s. It's the Soviets that fund Kim Il-sung's government to a great extent in this period. And when the Soviet Union collapses, that also means that North Korea's access to Soviet replacement parts for machines goes. So that likely contributed to the economic woes and the lack of ability for the North Korean government to purchase even like food to feed its people after it's clear that the crops are going awry. There's also just the fact that the trade with the Soviet Union accounted for something, I want to say, like 50% of the North Korean economy. And so when that trading partner goes away, that also means that the North Korean economy is just going to do a lot worse. It's going to have less funds to buy food aid to help feed its people. So that's a multifaceted way of saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union had a big impact on the famine. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is not just because it's important, because these are all human lives, but because Kim Jong-il takes power from his father. The famine's already kind of kicked off at this point. 1992, 1993, 1994, North Korea ain't doing so great. And then Kim Jong-il takes power in 1994, and in his first years of power, it must feel like the whole roof is falling down. And that's not to create sympathy or empathy for Kim Jong-il. It's to help explain what happened next. Because Kim Jong-il could have made a decision at this period of looking around and saying, okay, liberal democracy is clearly ascending. Communism is clearly falling apart. It's just us in Cuba now, or whatever. We're all alone. We're isolated. We're doing terrible. Even the Communist Party of China is all about liberal economics, and it's not as the Mao cult of personality is decades back. Maybe we should accept reality and go down this path as well. And what Kim Jong-il does instead is say, no, that sounds like a great way to threaten my monopoly on power. We talked a lot in our last video about China and the Communist Party being scared of losing their monopoly on power. They go through what's called a near-death experience during the Tiananmen Square and nationwide protests. And, part of like even Xi Jinping's governance today is a response to that. There's a perception that no, what actually needs to happen in North Korea is a doubling down on the cult of personality, on the one man rule over the party and over society in general. That the singular thought system, the monolithic ideological system, the cult of personality that really Kim Jong-il has been instrumental in building needs to not only not reform, but it needs to become even more intense. And maybe somewhere deep down, Kim Jong-il is doing a little bit like Xi Jinping did later on, decades later, when he took power and saying Mikhail Gorbachev, in reforming the Soviet Union, began to bring about its downfall. And so Kim Jong-il saying, by reforming, I'm potentially bringing about the downfall of North Korea. And at this point, North Korea is just the Kim regime. So reform means an existential threat to me. So they don't do it. Instead, they go with a policy called military first. I'm just going to write first like this. And the Korean term of military first is Songun. The idea is that whatever else is going on in the country, people are starving, the economy's falling apart, we're having to do international crime in order to just fund my lifestyle and keep the government afloat. We're completely isolated diplomatically. Whatever we do get, it goes to the military first. So there is, and the reason, of course, is because if state power is threatened, who can make sure that it stays in power regardless? It's the military. So you keep your benefactors, the North Korean military, happy. You build your army up to, at this point, it's the fourth largest in the entire planet, the fourth largest standing military. North Korea is not the fourth largest country on the planet. It's quite the achievement, especially in a famine period. This is going to be the raison d'être, the reason for being for the North Korean state for a time, is to keep the military afloat, to keep Kim Jong-il afloat. And there's a purge between 1997 and 2000 in which certain elements that might have been looking to reform during the famine period because of just how bad it got were purged. And this was ostensibly, from Kim Jong-il's point of view, is about making sure that people were held accountable for folks starving. But what it really was Kim Jong-il saying, okay, the worst is behind us now. It's time to get rid of people who piped up during this horrible period. Kim Jong-il has an innovative philosophy to go along with Juche, his father's philosophy. We talked about the 10 principles of the singular thought system, or the 10 principles of the ideological monolith. Kim Jong-il comes up with these rules to help his father, Kim Il-sung, perpetuate the ideological system of Juche. It functions effectively like the 10 Commandments. And just to illustrate how much this doubled down, here's some of the 10 Commandments that have been translated and simplified a little bit for us by Owen Hassig in their 2021 book, North Korea in a Nutshell. 10 principles of the monolithic ideological system. Entire society influenced by Kim Il-sung. Respect, revere, and loyalty to Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung, absolute authority. Believe in Kim's ideology. Carry out Kim's instructions. Strengthen party unity around Kim Il-sung. Imitate Kim Il-sung in personality and work style. Repay Kim Il-sung for life he has given you. Establish strong discipline in line with the uniformity of Kim Il-sung thought, and make sure that future generations are given the task of Kim Il-sung's building of Juche. So Kim Jong-il is is just like, he's going to take his time in power to double down on everything and to not let up even a little bit. And it looked crazy at the time. Western observers said it's got to be collapsing any day now. I'm sure that even people like in China and in Russia, like they all, there's this presumption, right? The Fukuyama quote that is often misinterpreted, but the end of history, the idea that the end of the Soviet Union was the moment when basically the turn happened, and if the Soviet Union is going to collapse and become a liberal democracy, which, spoiler, it didn't, but then every country eventually is going to do this, right? So the moment will come for North Korea, right? And Kim Il-sung is really standing alone and saying, no, liberal democracy is not coming here to North Korea, and my personal dictatorship will not be touched. This is a period when the gulags are in full force. So one of the most famous things that we think about when we think of North Korea is the political prisons, the Kwanliso and hold on, I'm losing my brain here. The Kwanliso and the Kyowaso. The Kwanliso being the far worse political prisons where people go there to die, to starve to death, to live on 500 grams of corn on a daily ration, to study the works and to be re-educated, even though the re-education is not part of some sort of way of preventing recidivism, because people will never leave. Where torture happens, where the 3 generations of family were punished, where people are disappeared by the Ministry of State Security. These sorts of gulags are still in use during the Kim Jong-il period, though they are going to decline as the situation stabilizes, and the familial punishment, the intergenerational punishments of, not just you being punished, but your children and grandchildren also being raised in these political prison camps. There's even schools built in the political prison camps for political prisoners, for the terrible crime of criticizing the regime or not believing 100% in all 10 principles of the monetary or the monolithic ideological system. These sorts of political crimes are not going to be punished intergenerationally as things start to loosen in the Kim Jong-il late period. But the gulags themselves are going to continue to be there, and they're still there today. There's about 6 of these worst of the worst Kwanliso camps under Kim Jong-un, as far as we know. That continues to be a means of control and the fear of being sent there, a way of making sure that there is no dissent in the ranks. Speaking of which, one of the best ways to determine whether you're going to die in the famine was through your class, your caste system. And this is one of the weirder aspects of North Korean history, is that during the early formation of North Korea and developing until it became a little bit less relevant in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, was the Songbun caste system. Let's see if I can write that thick enough. Songbun. Now, don't mistake this for the Songun military first policy. Songbun is a caste system that put people in North Korea, like literally every citizen in the whole country theoretically had a intelligence file made about them, and they were categorized into 3 places. The enemies of the party class was the very bottom. The wavering class is the majority, or rather the plurality of the country, the middle, and then the tippy top is like the loyal caste. Let me see if I can find the exact names. It's core, wavering, and hostile. So the core is the people who are absolutely loyal. Wavering is the bulk of the country, the plurality. And the hostile is all of the people that are like political enemies or whatever. They're part of the Yan'an faction or the Soviet faction. They get purged, or anyone who speaks badly ends up being down in these classes. That these sorts of things ended up determining your access to resources when the government distributed everything, your access to education and work, your children's access to education and work. You wouldn't want to marry outside of your class, because then, you would be pulled down into the class of your significant other, and your children would be too. And like I said, it becomes less relevant over time. But in the famine, one of the best ways to determine whether you're going to die or not, whether you're going to starve to death or not, is if you were maybe in one of these hostile, heavy regions like in the north. But despite all of the tensing up of the authoritarianism, despite the fact that the the cult of personality of Kim Il-sung continues on, and Kim Jong-il basically grafts himself onto it. All the portraits of Kim Il-sung, which it's a crime to let be dusty in your home, are not replaced, but a Kim Jong-il portrait is just put next to them. And when Kim Jong-il is around, he's mostly called the dear leader, where his father was the great leader. His son, Kim Jong-il's son, Kim Jong-un, is going to be called the great successor. But in any event, Kim Jong-il is going to be made the permanent general secretary after he passes. So his father's the eternal president. Kim Jong-il is the eternal general secretary. Who knows what Kim Jong-un will be? They're going to start having to make titles that don't actually take government offices, because then who will take the offices if it's just a bunch of ghosts that occupy them? But whatever. All of this continues, and yet, even though it's only really visible in retrospect, there is maybe just a loosening of North Korea's authoritarianism starting in the mid-aughts, so 2007. What am I talking about? These are the worst moments. The late 80s, the early 90s are existential crisis moment for communism, right? Soviets gone, Soviet bloc's gone, China's opened up and reformed, and people, hundreds of thousands of million people have died in North Korea, and people anticipate it's going to collapse at any moment. That moment, late 80s, 90s, mid 90s, begins to pass. And as the new millennium approaches, it's not as though things are going great in North Korea, but the military first policy is actually going pretty well. Kim Jong-il plays the powers against each other. He starts to triangulate with the United States and Europe to secure aid in exchange for suspending its nuclear program. And if you read defector accounts, all of this was just a ruse to get aid. And North Korea really never had an intent of slowing down its nuclear program. It was any negotiation with the West, be it a visit from Jimmy Carter in 1994, one of Kim Il-sung's last public appearances, seeing Jimmy Carter and agreeing a framework for denuclearization in exchange for aid, be it the visit from Madeleine Albright in 2000, I believe, again, denuclearization in exchange for aid, be it various agreements with the Bush administration after they're called part of the Axis of Evil in George W. Bush's 2002, I believe, State of the Union address, or one of the speeches he gave after 9/11. Over and over again, North Korea intimates that it's going to stop its nuclear program, but then reneges. And they're going to actually have their first successful nuclear test in 2006. Now, I think this is a significant turning point, not just because it means that there's another nuclear power on the planet, which in my humble opinion isn't great when we have lots of nuclear proliferation. It's also a big moment because I think this is a moment when the North Korean regime can at least feel a little bit more secure internationally. There is just a simple reality that having a nuclear weapon is a great way to avoid being invaded. And we, not to make this too presentist, but we've seen that Ukraine has been run over by the Russians. And would history be different right now? Would Russia have invaded Ukraine in 2022 if Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons as part of its departure from the Soviet Union in the 90s? Who knows? There's a reason that both India and Pakistan are insistent on having nuclear weapons, because they see each other as a threat. There's a reason that the People's Republic of China and under Mao Zedong wanted to have nuclear weapons. And there's a reason that Castro in Cuba in the 60s wanted to have Soviet nuclear weapons on his island, because the Americans had tried to invade or had the Bay of Pigs false flag operation or whatever, and tried to take Cuba and had been meddling for decades. There's a reason nukes, even though the fire bombs did more damage in Japan than the nukes did, maybe. I don't want to get relative about suffering here, but you get the point. Firebombing in Japan did a lot of damage. Firebombing in the Korean War did a lot of damage. Even if MacArthur had gotten his wish for tactical nukes, the firebombing probably decimated cities more than one nuclear bomb or one tactical nuke used on the battlefield would have done to North Korea. And so in 2006, there's reasons for Kim Jong-il to feel somewhat secure. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I said there might be a little bit of a loosening here, just a little bit. There's a problem that Kim Jong-il identifies in about 2007, which is that during the famine period, there are lots of bribes and there are lots of black markets that start to open for foodstuffs from outside of North Korea. And into the 2000s, there begins to be access to not just food in the black market, but media and things from outside North Korea that the North Korean government would really prefer people not have. Cell phones. And Kim Jong-il actually decries this as a watering down of Juche. However, Kim Jong-il doesn't really have the power to stop it. And we're going to see from 2007 onwards that the North Korean people are basically given permission to exist in a way that they just didn't have prior, right? If you're dying in the famine, you're dying. The state gives you everything, and if it's giving you nothing, you're dying. In the period after 2007, after this famine's passed, after North Korea acquires nuclear weapons, maybe it's out of just the fact that the North Koreans don't have the power to stop it. That is, the supreme leader doesn't have the power to stop it. Or maybe it's because there's just a little bit more of a relaxation and a realization that like North Korea actually could collapse if they don't let people just live. Things like black markets, a little bit of like opening up occurs in North Korea. And there's a sense that the opening up and reform saved the Chinese Communist Party, and that they flirted with fire a little bit by opening up too much too fast. But, in the realm, in the reign of Kim Jong-un, who we're going to talk about next, you're going to see that there is a new philosophy on the block that's going to say that we can have nuclear weapons, we can have state sovereignty, and we can enjoy the prosperity of socialism.